Greetings. My name is Marie von Roekel. I'm an architect working in the nonprofit and education space across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for over 15 years. More importantly for today, before that, I started my career as a user experience developer. So user experience and including inclusive design are components that are core still to my work. So this session, including inclusive design, was originally planned to be an interactive workshop, but I've adapted it to be more educational than experiential. So the focus is going to be more on what is inclusive design, some ways you can put it into practice, and finally some resources where you can go to learn more. So what do I mean when I ask the question, what is inclusive design? There are some terms you may have heard of that are related to inclusive design. Accessibility or accessible design tends to focus primarily on physical disabilities and/or compliance with regulations around accessibility. You may have also heard of universal design. The concept of universal design is designing for everyone with a single design. So it's a design that everyone can use without any adaptation. So in inclusive design, it's not always possible to have one product. So we look for different solutions for different groups. Universal design can be compatible with inclusive design. You may have also heard of human-centered design, design thinking, empathic design. Think of these in the realm of inclusive design. They're just different ways of looking at it. The core component of inclusive design is that it's a methodology. It's focused on additional differences or mismatches between the original design and the users that are using it. It can apply not only to physical spaces, such as accessible design, but it can also apply to digital spaces and policies. Part of this methodology also includes continual review and improvement. And it acknowledges that there are going to be mistakes. It's how we handle those mistakes and respond to them that matters most. So I actually have a personal interest here in inclusive design due to several factors that I will actually be mentioning throughout. It does come with a physical and a cognitive. So when I say that, what are some of the differences or mismatches that inclusive design is trying to address? Like accessible design, it is looking at physical abilities, but there can also be mismatches in age, gender, the language we use, whether your audience speaks the language that you are presenting your information in, or if they are at different levels. We have cultural and societal differences. What works in the Netherlands, Belgium, may not work in another country. Cognitive design, cognitive mismatches. This can be things like neurodiversity. It can be things like Down syndrome and other cognitive differences. You can also have learning style mismatches. If you're presenting a trading site that is primarily text-based, that requires reading, but your learner does best via listening, there's going to be a mismatch there. And of course, any other human differences that could exist. So there are 3 dimensions that we should be keeping in mind as we are looking at inclusive design. And these are identified by the Inclusive Design Research Center. The first is to recognize diversity and uniqueness. So you may think about a bell curve where there is this average that you're trying to design for. And then you have the people that are on the other ends of the bell curve, your outliers, or at the margins. And as you go further and further away from that hypothetical average or median, Your users are getting more and more diverse. So most people are different from that average in some way. So that means a single solution isn't going to work for most people. This second dimension is using an inclusive process and tools. So your design teams should be as diverse as possible and include people that have lived the experience of the users you're trying to design for. This is called using exclusion experts. This also looks at the principle of nothing about us without us. So we're not using the people with disabilities or mismatches as subjects of research, or that they're just here to say we've checked a box. They're actually part of the process. And then, of course, any tools that you are using in that process are also inclusive. So I mentioned accessibility earlier. If you are including people who are colorblind, for example, you want to make sure that the tools that you're using to support your design processes support colorblindness. Otherwise, you're excluding them from the process you're actually trying to include them in. And the final dimension is broader beneficial impact. So we need to be aware of the context and the broader impact of any design. And we want to make sure that we're trying to have our impact beyond that initial audience that we're designing for. So if we go to put it into practice, on Trailhead from Salesforce, we actually have a trail, and I've provided a link at the end, around inclusive design. So what can you do? First, you make sure you center on inclusive design is one size fits one. How is that product or design going to be adapted to fit each unique persona that you've defined? Interrupt. So we want to make sure that we are identifying our habits that are encouraging exclusion and interrupt those. We want to break the cycle. Want to be asking whose voice or whose contribution is missing in our process. Have you defined a new persona? Making sure you have someone that can be your exclusion expert for that new persona. And of course, seeking out those exclusion experts that can provide additional insights and may actually help you find even more personas you had not originally identified. And of course, remember, this is a long process. It's iterative. It's going to have challenges, and it's not going to be perfect. As I mentioned earlier, it's how we respond that makes the difference. So an activity you can do as part of inclusive design is creating personas. From Trailhead, there are some examples of persona spectrums. So we're looking at, there is an ability. It could be permanent, like blindness. It could be temporary, like someone has had eye surgery and is recovering. Or it could be situational. I've stepped outside and the sun is very bright, and so I can't see as well when I first walk outside. Those are examples of a physical spectrum. It could also be some other factors that I mentioned earlier, such as learning styles. And I touched on this earlier. If you have designed a text-heavy training site, but not provided videos for your auditory learners, that could be a challenge. I also mentioned the cognitive neurodiversity, our societal differences, such as non-native language speakers. And then there's another piece of this that I didn't mention earlier, which is infrastructure. Maybe your users are going to be in an unreliable internet or mobile data scenario, and the design that you have that is reliant on the highest and best performing network isn't going to work. Another tool that you can use, and this is from the Inclusive Design Research Center, they provide an inclusive design mapping tool. In this exercise, you bring your designers together. You choose from a list of facets, which are like pie pieces, and they provided templates for these, and you can create your own. And you map your user needs against the functional requirements. So on each of these pie slices, you put in what are the functional requirements, and then you ask the users to take it and mark where their needs are. You connect the dots between the requirements to make a shape, and then you connect the dots between the user's needs to make a second shape. And that helps you identify the gap. Once you've identified that gap, you can then have meaningful discussion on how you're going to address that gap. Now, there's more information on the facets and this process on their website. And again, this will be provided in the links at the end. One of the core of inclusive design is designing for one and extending to many. Examples of how this shows up in practice. If you are designing for color blindness, you may have a design that's using color to indicate statuses. By adding icons and text to that color indicator, you are allowing people with color blindness to more effectively interact with your design. But then that can actually extend to additional users, such as the situational blindness I mentioned earlier of someone who has walked outside into bright sunlight using their phone. Now, they may not be able to see the color, but they could see the icon or the text to understand how to continue interacting with your mobile solution. I've mentioned a couple of times online training. If you're including videos in your online training, make sure you include a transcript for those who are visual learners instead of auditory. That can then extend to neurodiverse people that read faster than people speak, and it can extend to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. If you're designing for low bandwidth users, having a low fidelity version is actually very helpful for them because your site then degrades gracefully into a version they can use. This then extends to people who may normally have a high bandwidth connection, but a disaster has come through and the infrastructure has been damaged to where now they have to use that low fidelity version. If you're designing for left-handed users in a mobile environment, maybe your buttons are going to be more centrally located on the screen. And this can extend to a right-handed person in a temporary or situational disability where they can't use their right hand. I have personal experience here because my right hand was injured, and for 3 months I couldn't use my right hand at all. And being able to switch some of my apps to be left hand navigatable made it much more usable for me. So a reminder, as you are looking at this design for one and extending to many, be aware of your ability biases. You may think that wearing a blindfold for a few hours will help you understand how blind people interact with the world, but there's more to it than just that short experience. So make sure if you are designing for a blind person, that you are including people who are blind. So a few resources that you may find useful. I've mentioned several Salesforce resources that are available. and the Inclusive Design Research Center and their Inclusive Design Guide. So I hope you found this a useful introduction to what is inclusive design, some ways that you can practice it, how it impacts people, a few resources that you can use. And I'd like to leave you with a final question in this age of AI and inclusive design. With the increasing prevalence of predictive and generative AI in our lives, how do we ensure we are including inclusive design best practices in the models and the training that we're providing to those tools? So thank you, and I hope you will find a way to bring this into your practices.